Hi, my name is Michael McConnell, and I am an Associate Professor of Pediatrics and Medicine at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. In this tutorial, I would like to help you understand how to distinguish between a patient who has a functional or innocent murmur and a patient who has an atrial septal defect. Hopefully, by using these simple techniques, you will improve your ability to diagnose functional murmurs and will not miss patients who have atrial septal defects. The reason this is important is as many as 70% of all children have a heart murmur, and the incidence of congenital heart disease is less than 1%. So therefore, you should not use solely the presence or absence of a murmur as your decision gate to send a patient to a pediatric cardiologist. Some patients with atrial septal defects have very subtle physical exam findings, so it is important that you develop your auscultatory skills to help you decide when to send the patient to the cardiologist. Contrast the physical exam findings between a patient with an atrial septal defect and one with a functional murmur. ASD patients have increased precordial activity, whereas patients with functional murmurs have normal precordial activity. The first heart sound in both should be normal. In patients with atrial septal defects, the second heart sound is widely split and fixed. Because the pulmonary valve always closes after the aortic valve. In functional murmur patients, the second heart sound is normal. The systolic murmur in patients with atrial septal defects should be a crescendo-decrescendo systolic murmur heard best at the upper left sternal border, caused by flow across the pulmonary valve. In the functional murmur patient, the murmur is also crescendo-decrescendo, but often has a musical vibratory characteristic and is often heard at the lower left sternal border. This murmur often gets softer when the patient stands. Patients with atrial septal defects can have diastolic rumbles, which are low-frequency sounds heard best with the bell of the stethoscope at the lower left sternal border. And patients with functional murmurs can have diastolic sounds caused by flow coming across the clavicle, so-called venous hum. Now listen to a recording made in a patient with an atrial septal defect with the stethoscope at the lower left sternal border. Note the normal first heart sound and also the diastolic rumble heard across the tricuspid valve. Now listen at the upper left sternal border in the same patient, listening for the widely split, fixed second heart sound and the systolic murmur across the pulmonary valve. Contrast those findings to those of a patient with a functional or innocent murmur using the diaphragm of the stethoscope at the lower left sternal border. Patients with functional murmurs have louder murmurs when they are supine, such as this recording. Now, standing the patient up should convince you that the murmur gets much softer when the patient is standing. So the take-home message that I hope you won't forget is that patients with functional murmurs have vibratory murmurs that decrease with the patient standing. Patients with atrial septal defects have increased precordial activity a widely split second heart sound, and a diastolic rumble across the lower left sternal border. I hope you will never forget to use these simple physical exam findings to help you distinguish between a patient with an atrial septal defect and one with a functional murmur.